Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. We're going to take just a little detour this week, and I think this is helpful as we get ready to approach the end of our series, as we're looking at the journey to life and how we got here. And we have been talking about an enormous series of problems that naturalism has in this quest. The idea of random mutation and natural selection, its explanatory capabilities to get us where we are today. And a lot of this comes down to two different competing worldviews and two different ideas. And what we're looking for in all of this is the best explanation out there. Obviously, none of us were around to see the beginning. So we have no eyewitnesses to this process. But what we do have enormous evidence for are the various pieces and parts that bring life together. We have evidence for the journey that life has taken. We have evidence in the fossil record. We have evidence of all of these different things. And the question that we have to ask ourselves at the end of the day is, what is the best explanation for the evidence that we have? And obviously, we don't want this to become a question of people saying, well, you're just simply relying on a God of the gaps theory. The idea being that anything that you don't know what could have caused it, you're just going to simply insert God into that process blindly and say, well, God's clearly the cause of that. The opposite side of that coin is what we also don't want to do is just simply insert luck into the process every time we run into a problem. And that is an equally bad problem as opposed to God of the gaps. It's chance solves all. It's luck is the ultimate answer to everything. And at some point, we all have to recognize that luck runs out. And so what we're looking for is the best possible explanation for the evidence that we have available to us today. And I think the problem that many of us have is that Darwinian evolution is all we're ever taught. And we've been taught that it is settled science, that it cannot be questioned, which is interesting because in no other area of science that I can think of are we ever told that anything is settled science that cannot be questioned, except evolution. Isn't that interesting? If you think about the radical discoveries that have been made in especially the last 125 years, let's say, going back to the early 1900s, with the discovery of Einstein's general theory of relativity, which led us into the conclusion of an expanding universe and all of the various consequences that brought up. We've talked at length about that in other series. But as we look at that, and as we have uncovered the fine-tuning of the universe, as we've uncovered the complexities of our DNA and the information that's stored, the programming that makes up us, the complexities of the cell, all of the scientific discoveries that we've made, if we were talking about any area of physics, no one would ever say, well, physics is completely settled science and therefore you can't question it. No one would ever say that because the field of physics has radically changed. What we know about how the universe was put together, I should say, has radically changed over the last 100 years. So it's interesting that we find this area where we are told that science cannot be questioned in this case, science being, ironically, a conclusion that has been reached, not necessarily where the scientific evidence leads us, but a philosophical conclusion of naturalism, that naturalism, applied naturalism, is the only scientific answer that's possible when it comes to this question of evolution. And the theory of evolution, random mutation, and natural selection cannot be questioned. It's settled science. That is a remarkably unscientific way to approach something. And as we look at this, there was something that hit the news here recently, and I thought it was a good reminder of this because next week, in the next episode, we're going to bring all of this together in one creature. And then we're going to look at everything else around it and look at the problems that we've got. Because once again, mathematics is going to become an issue for us. I've quoted this quote before, quoting from Clifford Longley. And this is more in reference to, again, the fine-tuning of the universe. But I love this quote, and I want to expand on it tonight a little bit longer. And tonight what we're talking about is this idea of the Infinite Monkey Theorem. Something that a lot of us have never heard of, but you'll know a little bit more of it probably when I start to spell it out. So let's talk about the quote. It says, the anthropic-design argument, and what it points to is of such an order of certainty that in any other sphere of science it would be regarded as settled. To insist otherwise is like insisting that Shakespeare was not written by Shakespeare because it might have been written by a billion monkeys sitting at a billion keyboards typing for a billion years. So it might. But the sight of scientific atheists clutching at such desperate straws has put new spring into the step of theists. And what he is referring to there is this idea of the Infinite Monkey Theorem. That has been in the news recently. I was listening to a podcast of William Lane Craig's the other day, the Reasonable Faith podcast, which excellent podcast. You should consider listening to it. Dr. Craig does a fantastic job in all things apologetics. But when we look at this question, I want to go through this because this was a study done by, it's called A Mathematical Evaluation of the Finite Monkey Theorem by Stephen Woodcock and J. Falletta from the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. And this was a recent study that was released, and it's addressing this question of the Infinite Monkey Theorem. So let's talk about what that is for a minute. Clifford Longley is kind of describing it here, but let's define it, because I think in their paper they do a pretty good job. It says, in its most popular form, the Infinite Monkey Theorem states that if you had an infinite number of monkeys and/or an infinitely long period of time, then a monkey pressing keys at random on a typewriter would eventually be certain to produce the works of William Shakespeare. Okay, that's an excellent illustration of what we're getting to in all of this. You know, in this journey, what we've talked about are all the various steps along the way where naturalism just has no answer for the evidence that we see here. And naturalism has to resort to ideas of luck. That if we just had an infinite amount of time and chance and matter, eventually we would end up with the universe that we have. The problem with that is we don't. We don't have an infinite amount of time. We don't have an infinite amount of matter. And ultimately speaking, we know there's not an infinite amount of luck out there. And that's going to be problematic. I want to come back again many episodes ago, and you can search back through the episodes to look at this discussion on infinity. But we talked about the idea of infinities in reality. Now, infinity as a concept is a legitimate, valid mathematical concept. But outside of the realm of mathematics, literal infinities in the real world do not actually exist. They become a logical contradiction, and they cannot possibly be made to exist. So, for example, if we said that we had an infinite number of marbles, but we took 99% of them and got rid of them, and we had 1% of the marbles left, how many marbles would we have? We would have an infinite number of marbles. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Because ultimately speaking, you know that you got rid of 99%, but 1% of infinity is still infinity. And so it becomes a logical contradiction. I don't want to dive too deeply into that. Please see the previous episodes talking about that. What we have going forward, the best scientific evidence we have available to us, again, the best scientific evidence, is that the universe had an absolute beginning point. And we know this whether we use Einstein's general theory of relativity or his special theory of relativity, whether it was Hartle-Hawking or whether it's Borde-Guth-Vilenkin, however we're looking at this, the idea that the universe is past eternal cannot have occurred. Because in any expanding universe, which we know that we live in, there has to be an original beginning point. And Hawking proved it. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proved it. When you look back at these different ideas, the current science, the most current science that we have indicates that the most likely answer to the age of the universe is that the universe is not infinitely old. You could also apply other different scientific and mathematical concepts to that. The second law of thermodynamics, for example, eventually the universe will run out of energy and the universe will grow cold and die. Not a very happy thought. But if the universe was infinitely old, at some point in the infinite past, the universe would have already grown cold and died. That hasn't happened. So again, we have proof that the universe cannot be infinitely old in the past. You can have a potential infinite going forward. So if you start with a beginning point and you always add one more day to it, potentially you could go on indefinitely doing that. But it never actually reaches infinity. It's always a potential infinity. because you just keep adding one more day. And even though the number would get really, really big, it does have an original finite beginning point. And so when we talk about these kinds of things, and where this relates to our infinite monkey theorem, is these gentlemen went in and determined, is it actually possible that monkeys typing at keyboards could actually produce the works of William Shakespeare? Is that actually what's going to happen? And perhaps not surprisingly, the answer is no. So what they did was, and I'll quote from the study, it said, we take chimpanzees working a chimpanzee's working lifespan to be just over 30 years, and the heat death of the universe to occur at 10 to the 100th power years. Assuming that the current population of around 200,000 chimpanzees remains constant until the end of the universe, and then they figure the number of seconds per year, how many keystrokes a monkey can do. I give them credit. It's an interesting thought exercise. But they actually walked through not looking at an infinite number of monkeys and an infinite amount of time, but they put a realistic attachment to it and said, okay, we know how old the universe can possibly be from the beginning point until there's ultimately the heat death of the universe. And we assume that there's a couple 100,000 monkeys, and they even take it from the perspective of saying, look, we're going to assume the population remains constant. Is it possible that monkeys typing for 10 to the 100th power years, it's a lot of years, are ever going to be able to produce the works of William Shakespeare? And perhaps not surprisingly, the answer is no. Their conclusion was it is not plausible. Even with possible improved typing speeds or an increase in chimpanzee populations, these orders of magnitude can be spanned to the point that monkey labor will ever be a viable tool for developing written works of anything beyond the trivial. As such, we reject the conclusions from the Infinite Monkeys Theorem as potentially misleading within our finite universe. Their paper, of course, was not entitled the Infinite Monkey Theorem. They were looking at, remember, the article of their paper was the Finite Monkey Theorem. And so they brought back from this concept of an absolute infinite number, and they put a realistic number attached to it. Were they able to get monkeys producing the word bananas at random? Yes, they were. They were even able to get I chimp, therefore I am. So they were able to get some very small things logically to eventually come out. But they couldn't even get, let alone the works of Shakespeare, they determined to be unlikely to the power of 6.4 times 10 to the 7,448,254th power, which is just an insanely big number. Even Curious George, let alone Shakespeare, they couldn't even produce Curious George. So monkeys typing at keyboards for the life of the universe still can't even produce that. You may be asking the question, okay, this is moderately entertaining. Why are we talking about this? The reason I want to remind us and kind of bring us back in on this is we have been taking this journey, and at every step along the way, there are these pitfalls waiting out there. And the answer of naturalism every single time, how do you get past this question where we have a choice, a clear choice between we see the fingerprint of intelligence, we see something like, for example, the information contained inside the DNA that's inside of us, the information that makes up us. How do you get that? Now, the intelligent design person, the creationist, would look at this and say, clearly intelligence is the only thing capable of explaining computer programming. Therefore, intelligence is clearly the best answer. The naturalist, when faced with something like the most complex computer code ever discovered, has no choice but to say, given enough time and random chance, it might just happen. Luck. Luck is the answer. And it becomes more desperate and grasping at straws than an infinite number of monkeys typing on an infinite number of keyboards. And that's where that quote comes from. So as we've been looking at this, there is this growing list of problems that every time we face them, the naturalist is forced into this question of saying, well, luck could have done it. And I don't think we appreciate how big that list is or how impressive that it's grown. You know, I've quoted from Richard Dawkins multiple times in The Kant Delusion, and over and over again, Dawkins' reliance is on luck. I've quoted, for example, I think I've read this quote many times. once the initial stroke of luck has been granted, and he's talking about a life initially appearing, once the initial stroke of luck has been granted, it's an interesting statement. So we have to grant him that it's possible that luck is capable of bridging the gap between lifelessness and life. And then I believe, in my opinion, he misuses the anthropic principle to say, well, look, we look around us and we see life in existence and we see that it's here. So clearly it's happened. Therefore, since it's happened, it could have happened. And therefore, that tells us it did happen and luck is the best explanation. Well, he's right about part of that. Clearly, life is here and it did happen. But is luck a valid explanation? And mathematically, I would argue that the answer to that is no. So again, that's what he's talking about here. He says, once the initial stroke of luck has been granted, and the anthropic principle most decisively grants it to us, natural selection takes over, and natural selection is emphatically not a matter of luck. Nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified. For example, my colleague Mark Ridley in Mendel's Demon has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic cell, our kind of cell with a nucleus and various other complicated features such as mitochondria, which are not present in bacteria, was an even more monumentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. It means it needs even more luck to get there. We've talked about the complexity of the cell. The origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was of the same order of improbability. How's he jumping all of these gaps? Luck. Now, as an intelligent design person, as a person who believes in that intelligence is the best answer, that design is clearly what we're seeing, I would look at you and say, why would you? I would never just insert God blindly into these things. What we see is the fingerprint of intelligence. What we see is an intelligent mind is the only answer for how you get something so complex as the cell. An intelligent mind is the only answer for how you jump from lifelessness to life, and the incredible complexity that has to go into that, which we've just barely scratched the surface on. An intelligent mind is the only thing capable of describing how we could have possibly gone from ordinary normal life that we see around us, something like a starfish, to something that actually has consciousness and is able to think and speak and talk, which is unique within the animal kingdom. So when we look around us and we see all of that, naturalists are forced to insert luck at every stage. And yet nobody goes, well, that's just a God of the gaps in reverse. That's just sticking luck in on everything. And yet that's the quotes that we see. I've quoted from Stephen Hawking in his Discovery Channel series, Stephen Hawking, The Story of Everything. Hawking just kind of glossed over the whole thing. He said, life is one of the strangest phenomenon known. Okay? It's an interesting start. See where he goes. In my opinion, it shows that the universe is capable of almost anything. He just gave creative powers to the universe, is what he just did right there. Yet it amazes me that we know so much about how the universe began many billions of years ago, but we have yet to discover how life itself began. The most likely explanation is probably that we are an accident just by chance. Chance, if you look it up in the dictionary, there's another word for chance, it's luck. Just by chance, some molecules bumped into each other at random until finally one formed that could copy itself. Then began the slow process of evolution that led to all of the extraordinary diversity of life on Earth. Life seems to be simply what matter does given the right conditions and enough time. What he means by that is enough luck. Time, matter, and chance is all that we need. That is for Stephen Hawking, who is a brilliant physicist, that is a remarkably unscientific comment. A couple of molecules just bumped into each other. If you ask an origin of life biologist, is that a good process for how life could have began? They would probably chuckle at you as they said, no, Dr. Hawking should probably stick with physics. Because that's not even, again, that's a terrible statement for him to have made. Again, in his lifetime, he was a brilliant physicist, but that's just awful. Over and over and over again, throughout Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, over and over again, I'm not going to quote them all tonight, but again, over and over, we fall back on luck. Luck could answer the question. All we need is just enough luck. I want to caution you as we get ready to take this next step in the journey. Because at each step in this process, the question you're going to have to ask yourself is, do we see the fingerprint of a creator, an intelligent designer, or do we see a situation where luck can simply answer it all? And that's been the journey that we've been on this whole time. And I want you to consider that and think about that infinite monkey theorem, that when we finally rein things in and we say, you don't get to play with infinites just to keep posing an infinite amount of luck to the situation. There are finite conclusions that have to be drawn from a finite amount of time and a finite amount of luck that can be brought to bear. Is it probable? What is the most likely explanation? Which explanation has the best explanatory power to tell us how did we get here? I want you to think about each one of these. The leap from lifelessness to life, the production of DNA, the information contained in DNA, the complexity of the cell, the formation of complex traits, the irreducible complexity of complex functions, the irreducible complexity of systems. If we jump back further than that, the creation of the universe from nothing, the fine-tuning of the universe, the fine-tuning of our galaxy, solar system, and planet. Time and time and time again throughout the journey from nothing to where we are today, we reach these points where luck simply cannot be relied upon as an answer. And it's not that we're inserting God into this question and saying, well, if it wasn't luck, it had to be God. No. When we think about something like the information contained in DNA, clearly, in our experience, the only thing capable of producing complex, intelligent coding is an intelligent mind. The coding that's inside us is anything but random. It's anything but, it just might happen. The coding that makes up us is very specifically put together, and no amount of monkeys typing for no amount of time could ever touch that either. Let alone what we're looking for in terms of something as complex as William Shakespeare's works or something like that. So therefore, the infinite monkey theorem and why we've talked about this. You cannot expect a random process to produce something that we know. In this digital age, we know what produces intelligent programming. It's an intelligent mind. And that's what we see when we look at us. We're going to bring all of this together next week, and we're going to talk about life transitioning between the various forms. We've talked about all these pieces. We're now going to put them together into one creature, and we're going to determine, is it possible, if it happened once, would you ever get all the rest of the diversity of life that we see? That is a great question for next week. I want to thank you so much for joining us this week. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. I definitely hope you'll stick around next week and come back and join us again. I also want you to remember you can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. You can find our website at prooftograce.com. Lots of good resources there to answer questions that you may have. And if you have a question, you can always reach out to us on our website via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.